Nicholas Wolterstorff, a former professor of philosophical theology at Yale, is typically known for publishing lofty philosophical ideas. But after encountering a crisis, he chose to write a memoir instead. The memoir is about his son, Eric, who was only 25 years old when he had a fatal mountain climbing accident. Nicholas wrote, "The world is different now. Something is over. In the deepest levels of my existence, something is finished, done. My life is divided into before and after." Nicholas utilized the book to discover his own emotional healing, writing that his son was a gift that was snatched away, and I didn't know how much I loved him until he was gone. Is love like that? He asks. And I believe the answer is very often it is. Often we don't recognize how deeply we loved someone until we lose them, or how valuable something is to us until we lose it. For example, when COVID struck and forced us to stay home, many of us didn't know how much we would miss restaurants and eating out. We didn't know we would miss birthdays and anniversaries so much. We didn't know we would miss attending a family reunion. We didn't know we could actually miss driving our cars or traveling. We didn't know we would miss shopping in grocery stores for food until we had to rely on curbside service or delivery. We didn't know how much we would lose during the time of COVID either. We didn't know we would miss so many things until we were unable to enjoy them as we experienced this crisis. These experiences have impacted us and changed us. Thankfully, even in the face of these crises, we've had some opportunities to experience joy together, and we've had a lot of experiences, unfortunately, of pain. These experiences of joy and suffering will mark our lives and possibly how we will respond to future flu and pandemic crises in the future. In Latin and Greek, the word crisis means point of decision. In a crisis, events tumble in fast and furious. In those moments, some of us would probably prefer to return to bed and hide under the covers, while others rush in to meet the crisis head on. Whether we're prone to hide or rush into battle with a battle cry, in a moment of crisis, we do have to decide how to respond. Inaction typically is not an option. Though King Saul was hoping that by not choosing an action as he and the nation faced a crisis, he was hopeful the crisis would resolve on its own in their favor. However, in this case, King Saul had set things into motion with his backstabbing and deceitful actions. The crisis that threatened the safety of the new kingdom of Israel. He could not afford to be indecisive as the crisis loomed at Israel's gates. Constant land disputes and broken agreements by both Saul and the Philistines caused the Philistines to gather outside the capital city of Israel. After intense fighting, the Israelites found themselves outnumbered and outpowered. Recognizing that the Israelites had retreated from the battlefield, the Philistines chose a champion named Goliath, who stood on the battlefield demanding a worthy opponent be sent to meet him in battle. The winner of the fight would decide the winning nation. Indecisive, the young shepherd David, who was sent to the battlefront by his father with provisions for his brothers, saw for the first time the power of the Philistine army, and he heard the challenge. He saw Israel's opponents spread out across the battlefield with helmets, shields, and armor of bronze. In the valley below, between the two opposing forces, stood a mighty giant named Goliath, who was the Philistine champion. His enormous size sent shockwaves of terror through the Israeli army, and they had never seen anyone so tall and so muscular before. Cowering in the camps, no one was brave enough to step onto the field while Goliath stood out there. And when David saw this, he immediately made a decision that he would step onto the field with Goliath. Though Saul and his advisors initially ridiculed David, eventually Saul recognized David's determination. So he attempted to loan David his own armor. However, another crisis arose when the protective armor didn't fit. Yet as Saul freaked out, David simply walked to a nearby river and calmly took 3 stones and placed them in his bag and then stepped onto the battlefield. In each moment of crisis, David processed what he was about to face, then confronted it boldly and bravely. It's quite a contrast between his response to a moment of crisis and turning to the Gospels with Jesus' disciples when they faced a crisis. The disciples were traveling with Jesus, who was asleep in the back of the boat one night when they encountered a life threatening storm. Now, storms on the Sea of Galilee come easily and quickly because the waves tend to grow very intense as the sea is surrounded on all sides by mountains, which cause the sea to act like a giant bathtub. As the waves spilled into their boat, the disciples were convinced the ship would sink. Meanwhile, while they were panicking, Jesus slept. When Jesus woke, he calmly rose from the bench he was resting on and ordered the sea and storm to be peaceful. Repeatedly, we see too that Jesus, when facing a crisis, remained calm. Both David and Jesus were patient and kind men, and their non-anxious presence provided peace for others around them. And they provide an example for us to discover how we too can be a non-anxious presence in the times of crises. First, they're humble. In the case of David, when he speaks to Saul, even though Samuel had secretly anointed David as Israel's new king to replace Saul, David remained respectful and polite. When David stepped onto the battlefield, Goliath taunted him, but David didn't enter the trash talking department. Instead, he simply warns Goliath what will happen unless Goliath retreats. And we witness in Jesus' humility when he brings the disciples together and allows them to be part of the decision-making process. He commissions the disciples with authority to go forth to heal the sick and proclaim God's love. Living humbly, both Jesus and David are confident in God's presence. As a shepherd, David had learned how to recognize that God remained with him, whether he was guiding sheep to still streams as they passed the shadowed valleys, or he was facing the danger of a bear or a lion. Jesus also was confident God remained with him as he journeyed around Galilee, declaring God's love, healing the sick, and offering redemption to outcasts. David and Jesus also remain in close conversation with God as they both spend time alone with God, praying and meditating on God's words. With regular prayer, they recognize that they are equipped with a powerful spiritual tool which has enabled them to focus on the crisis at hand. And no matter how chaotic it becomes, they recognize their inner peace and they share that non-anxious presence with others. It is likely that David learned how to be a non-anxious presence from his father, Jesse. Jesse was the grandson of Boaz and Ruth. And as you probably know, the book of Ruth was named for Ruth. Perhaps Jesse discovered from his grandmother, Ruth, the importance of facing crises without anxiety. After all, she was a foreigner who immigrated to Israel with her mother-in-law and faced her own types of crises. She left her parents' home and lost the homeland that she had known all her life as she immigrated to a new land. She was unable to get a job or financial support as she wasn't married and didn't qualify for widow's assistance. Yet, she remained calm, recognizing that good things would fill her life as she trusted God to care for her needs. Passing this on to her son Obed, he then passed that to his son Jesse, who passed this on to his son David. Trusting God and through prayer, recognizing that no matter what crisis was experienced, God would remain present. This is what Nicholas Wolterstorff discovered after losing his son. And it's what John Wesley, one of the leaders who founded the Methodist Church, discovered as well. On one of his journeys across the Atlantic Ocean from England, he writes that a fierce storm broke out and the ship pitched and tossed like a bathtub toy. While John and the others clung to their bunks and hid under the covers, he said he observed a group of Moravian brethren who had gathered calmly in the center of the room to hold a worship service. They sang praises to God, and none of them seemed remotely bothered by the crisis the ship was suffering. It was at this point John realized they had a waterproof faith, and he needed their faith. So he prayed from that day forward that God would give him the ability to sing songs of praise and to ride out life's storms and moments of crisis with as much confidence as they exhibited. John recognized that their faith claimed that no storm was too fierce, no opponent too great, nor any crisis too complete. John also recognized through these Moravian brethren that the miracle that took place on the Sea of Galilee was not the miracle of Jesus calming the storm. Rather, it was the miracle of calming the disciples in the storm. Though we've experienced the storm of COVID and we've had a number of crises, thankfully, the Father of our fathers, who taught us to remain a non anxious presence, has helped us stay afloat. The faith of our fathers has assisted us and reminded us that we would conquer COVID through Christ and that we would prevail, for God is present. Remaining in prayer and singing songs of praise, we have faced these chaotic times, recognizing that due to COVID, our lives are divided into before and after. Yet before COVID, God was with us. And after COVID, God is with us. And we will see that God has remained with us through this whole chaotic time. Thankfully, we have made it through with praises and prayers, recognizing that when a crisis comes crashing down on us, we are in the hands of God who remains at hand and sees us through our hour of need. The faith of our fathers has taught us to trust in God, to remain confident in God's promises, and no matter how bad things get, even when we lose a loved one, we acknowledge that we have nothing to fear, not even death itself, for God is with us. Experiencing the heartache of loss and the pain of crises, and thankfully, we've had a faith passed on to us, so we know for sure that God is with us. And due to this, we find our sense of calmness and we experience peace. Whenever there is stillness, writes the novelist Annie Dillard, there is the still small voice, God speaking from the whirlwind, nature's old song and dance. God is in control, for God has never abandoned us, because God recognizes what would be lost without us, as we also recognize what would be lost if we didn't have God. On this Father's Day, let us be appreciative that we have been introduced to God, whether it was through our father or a father-like figure, someone who loved the church and loved God and wanted us to experience that love. For God's great love for us remains constant throughout the ages.